Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. In this unprecedented time, we hope that you are all safe and healthy, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here today. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. This webinar is pre-recorded, so there will be a Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you do have any questions during this presentation, please email them to instructor@theceshop.com. They will be happy to help you. If you miss anything, don't worry. We are going to send you an invitation to the recording of this webinar as well. My name is Amy Chamberlain, and I'm an instructional designer at the CE Shop, the leading provider of online real estate education. Today, we are going to review the top 10 most confusing real estate topics. Let me give you an introduction to our instructor. Sandesh Bilji comes to us with over 20 years in the real estate industry, as well as many years as a real estate instructor and a motivational speaker. Let's turn this over to Sandesh to get started.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for being here today. As we mentioned, we're going to talk to you about the most confusing topics when it comes to your real estate exam. So what are those topics? And we're going to review those. Let's first go over our agenda. Again, the top 10 most confusing real estate topics. Then we'll have an opportunity for you to ask some questions, provide some additional resources, and then conclude. So let's go ahead and dive in. When we talk about the most confusing things that you need to understand, the number one question that comes up, how do I pass the state exam? And having been someone who was once in your shoes many years ago, I experienced the same thing. And as a licensed real estate instructor, what I've been able to determine along the years is what exactly are the most relevant and prevalent topics that I need to know, that I worry about. I know there's a lot on your mind, and there's a lot of information to understand. Sometimes it's so confusing with the terms that we have to understand, the math, and all the different conceptual questions that we constantly think about in our brain. Let's not worry about this today. And the reason for that is because we're here to help. So the question again that you have is, how do I pass the state exam? Well, let's go ahead and help you with that. The first thing we have to understand is we need to be prepared. And how do we truly and accurately prepare for this? It is a challenge, and we understand that. In preparing for any challenge, we know that we need to practice. Practice, as we know, makes perfect, but confidence is also born from practice. We need to focus on your mindset so you can really declutter all of the things that are floating around in your brain, and that you can stay focused on what you're focusing on here. We have to have a plan. And that plan is really a strategy. That strategy to prepare. We want to, first of all, make sure that you're in an optimal spot to be able to do that. Let people around you, your family, your friends, and those that are around you, your biggest supporters, know that you need time to dedicate towards this. When your door is shut, you put a note up there that said, I'm working on my plan. We got to make sure we commit to that. And that's where commitment comes in. You need to have a schedule. Many of you also might be working other jobs or might have other endeavors that are taking up your time. We have to make sure we make a commitment. Is this in your schedule? Study time and prep time doesn't happen when it's convenient. You have to make sure that you allocate time to be able to do that. And then the most important thing, as you know, is to think positive. We have to have a positive way of thinking. It's no longer, I think I can, or I hope to. It's I will. That positive entity. And all of this is part of the preparation process. So I think if we can go back and make sure we have that set, then the things that we're going to talk about as far as the topics are going to come to you with a little bit more ease. So let's review what creating a plan entails. First and foremost, you want to review the candidate handbook. That handbook tells you everything that you need to know. And that could answer a lot of your questions that could be creating or causing a little bit of that anxiety. Review the national and the state outline so that you have a clear understanding of exactly what you're about to embark on. Review your course lesson requirements. Again, in your syllabus, it's very clear of what the expectations and outcomes are. Review the key terms in the glossary. We know that there are so many key terms, but again, use that in context and make sure that you truly understand the glossary, not just what the term means, but really when is it used in context as it relates to the specific topics that you have been learning up to this point. And you want to take practice exams and use that exam prep edge. Again, we talked about practice makes perfect. I often talk to individuals who may have had an athletic background or acting or as a musician. And I ask individuals, how much time do you practice before competition or performance? And if you've ever been in that position before, you know the answer to that question. It takes an incredible amount of time. And you'll realize this when you get into the real estate industry, that you're going to have to practice for everything that you do when you're going on listing appointments and working with buyers. So it starts here. So I want to make sure that you are all in the right mindset for this. Now, many times people ask questions, what do I study? What should I focus on? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you take a look in front of you, what you will see is a breakdown of the topics that we need to put time towards. That'll give you an indication of maybe how much time you should be spending on each of the different chapters. You'll see that 17% is coming from contracts. Contracts are an important part of real estate. 13% is on the real estate practice. And what we mean by that are real life concepts. Another 13% is on general agency. And we're going to talk about that today because agency representation is critical and extremely important. And then you can see the rest. I know what some of you are thinking right away. How much math? I get that a lot. 10%. 10% is on math. And when we see the other 10% on financing, that does include some math, but that's all about the real estate financing principles and processes. So just take a look at this to understand where do you need to be as far as your preparation. Now, look, what topics do you find to be the most confusing? What I want you to do right now is grab your pen and a piece of paper and just take a moment. Let's take a moment. And I want you to write down, what do you feel are the most confusing topics? I know right now that you can grab your textbook and it's highlighted in every different color. And you can sit here and open up any page and say that's confusing. But the reality is, I believe you know more than you think that you know. One of the biggest problems that we face when we're learning as adult learners is we tend to focus on the things we know, and we tend to sort of push aside the things we don't know. I would like to address the elephant in the room, and I want to focus on what are we having a hard time with. So go ahead and write those down, because that's what we're going to focus on today. Now, I'm sure that if I had an opportunity to ask every single one of you, what are the topics that are most confusing? I bet you're not alone. I bet most of you right here today are saying the same ones. So as a result, what we've done is we've figured out the top 10 most confusing real estate topics. So let's take a look at our list. Number 1, agency. We just saw how much on our test is on agency. So that's really important that we're going to cover that. Number 2, appraisal. Number 3, contracts. Number 4, estates. Number 5, financing. Number 6, forms of ownership. Number 7, land use control and zoning. Number 8, property taxes. Number 9, transfer of title. And number 10, your favorite, math. Now, some of you are probably saying, did he just steal my piece of paper? No, I didn't do that. And I cannot predict the future either. But what I do know is by talking to thousands and thousands of agents that are in your same situation, I'm fully aware of what we're confused about, because we all are. And that's why we're here today. So again, on your list, check off the ones that I was able to predict, and let's go through these together. The first thing we have to focus on is this. The law of agency is the same in every state. Is that true or false? What do you think the answer is? Well, we know the answer is false. And why we talk about this is because even though we're here on a national platform, it's very critical that you pay attention to what's going on in your local geographic area. Because every state has different rules and regulation when it comes to compliance. It's very important that we understand that. Now, let's talk about agency. So if you're looking at this sphere right here, let's make sure we understand a few of the simple concepts that could lead to confusion. The first thing I want to really focus on is the consumer, okay? And I'm going to do something a little untraditional here in a sense, and I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to go counterclockwise because I want to start with the consumer. And then I want to talk about the customer and the client. Who is the consumer? The consumer is anyone that's seeking real estate. The customer is someone who's being represented by someone else, by a different agent, or they're representing themselves. And what that means is you are not representing them. And the client means someone that you owe fiduciary responsibilities to because you are in fact representing them. You are their agent and they are your client. Now I want to give you a very elementary example of this concept because it could get confusing if we don't understand the basic principles. Now, I ask you this rhetorical question: why do people go to the mall? Think about it for a moment. The last time we were able to go to the mall, when did you go and why? Maybe it was just to go and walk and get your steps in. Different reasons for different people. For me, it was usually to go to the food court, right? Because then I have so many different options that I could choose from. But wherever you go, we all have different reasons. So when you step foot in the mall, you are a consumer. This is metaphorically speaking. When you walk into that store, whichever that store is, you are going there for a particular reason. You're seeking that. That makes you a customer of that store. And when you buy something at that store, you are a client of that store. Turn that into a real estate comparable. If you're at an open house and somebody walks into your open house, you don't know who they are. They're a consumer. They're seeking something. We don't know. When they start talking to you about real estate and they've identified that they're working with another agent, that's when they become a customer to you because you don't represent them. However, if that individual is not being represented and they want you to represent them, they then become a client of yours. That's the difference between consumer, customer, client. And that's where fiduciary responsibilities come in, is that we owe fiduciary responsibilities to our client. Cold AC, care, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, accounting, and confidentiality. The one thing we have to remember is that when it comes to everybody we interact with, we owe honesty to all. Very important. Express agency means that an agency relationship has been created. And that could be in writing or it could be verbally. However, implied agency, which is what we're trying to stay away, and that's why we want to define the agency relationship before confidential information has been disclosed, but no later than entering into an agreement. An implied agency means that based on your actions, one might make the assumption that you're operating in an agency fashion. So my recommendation to all is when we are ready to practice real estate and we engage anyone, always make the delineation between consumer, customer, client, and determine if there is non-agency relationship or if there is a agency relationship. This here is very important. Now, let's start thinking. I know there's a lot going on, but let's start thinking. Which appraisal approach will most likely be used for a newly constructed single-family home, which is nestled in an area of income-producing apartment buildings? Take a moment and reread this. Which appraisal approach, that's what I'm asking for. We're looking for a newly constructed single-family home. So we have a new single family home, and if it's new, that means there may not be other new homes. And the reason why was we're in an area of apartment buildings. So having said that, I don't really have much to compare that to. So we're not going to use the sales comparison approach of comparables. But as a result, because of the fact that we have a unique property, one way to do this is to go through the cost approach. And when we look at a newly single family home, we can look at this based on what it would cost to replace or reproduce that property. And that's why the answer is the cost approach. So that's an example of how we utilize the information given and do the process of elimination, which I think might be very helpful to all of you. Now, speaking of the income approach, there's someone I want to introduce you to. This individual's name is Irv. Irv is very friendly, and Irv will be your gatekeeper to helping you with all things when it comes to the income of real estate. Income, rate, value. Income is your net operating income, which is your annual, right, for the year. That's very important. I said it a few times. Rent or income coming in, minus your annual expenses. That's going to be your NOI, your net operating income. Your rate is going to be your capitalization rate. And we look at that as far as a risk factor on investment property. How profitable will your entity be? And value, as we know, is your price. What's the value of that property? So you look at your income rate value, and if you knew that if you were to write this out into formulas using the T-bar, that income equals rate times value. Rate equals income divided by value. And value equals income divided by rate. Take some time and understand that formula. When you do, write it down, because it will truly help you, because we know that we have to give you 2 out of the 3 numbers in any of these areas. And Irv will help you get to the right answer. So again, let's think. Can you identify the essential elements of a valid contract? This is something that's often confusing for a lot of people, is this concept of valid, void, and voidable. Let's talk about a valid contract. Look at this acronym here, CLOAK. Let's go through this. And as we go through this, this is what we come up with here. And that's consent. And what we mean by consent is, was it done on your own? Was it voluntary? Because we know we can't enter into a contract for involuntary reasons. Lawful. Was it within the framework of the law? Was it legal? Offer. You have to have an offer and acceptance in order for a contract to be exchanged. And then consideration. And remember, consideration means anything of value. Don't just automatically assume money, but it's anything of value. You must have all of these elements in order for us to have a valid contract. And I just want to make a note of something, because this comes up all the time. If I said to you, these are the essential elements, then I have a question for you. And that is this: is signature an essential element of a valid contract? I want you to think for a moment before you answer. Now, if you answered false, you are correct. If you're wondering why, because validity is not the same as enforceability. Statute of frauds says that you have to have contracts in writing to be enforceable. However, you need CLOAK to be valid. So those are things that I want to make sure you understand the difference. And again, if that's confusing, make a note of that and go back and reference it so you can look at the difference between the two. Now, who is most likely to be the flawed party in a voidable contract? Remember, the key to an avoidable contract is, on the surface, it appears to be valid. But there's an element that could have this contract rescinded by one party. So let's look at what we have here. A minor who enters into a contract, a real estate agent who is engaged in a commission dispute, a seller who knowingly signed a contract with a minor, and a buyer who purchased a property as is and later discovered termites. Well, if you're a minor and you are ultimately going to perform the terms of a contract, there's a couple of things that I want you to understand. is that because you're a minor and you enter in a contract, if it has all the elements of a valid contract, it could appear to be valid. But being that minor makes the contract voidable because that minor could rescind the contract, but they could also fulfill the terms of the contract. So that's the essence of what voidable means. Okay. Now, I talked already about the statute of frauds, and that's enforceability. It's absolutely critical that you understand the different elements of termination of contracts. Now, if I could offer one piece here where a lot of agents get confused, is there's a difference between termination of contracts, termination of agreements, and termination of agency. Now, I'm going to repeat that because I want you to write this down. Termination of contracts, termination of agency, and termination of agreements. Those are different. Learn those and make sure you don't get confused by those. And then again, we talked about valid, void, and voidable. Okay. Void means that one of the elements is missing, which then makes it not valid. And voidable means that on the surface it's valid, but again, there's one element, there's one factor that could cause the contract to be rescinded. And make sure you go back and review what those are. Now, moving to a different topic, a topic that everyone gets somewhat confused about is this whole element of forms and types of ownership. Now, let me ask you a question. When you are in a property, you either blank or blank. How would you finish the rest of that sentence? I either blank or blank. I either rent or I own. That's it, right? If you rent, you have what's called a leasehold estate. And there's 4 types of leasehold estates. There's a periodic tenancy, which is similar to a month-to-month in the fact that you will continue to pay and your agreement continues to stay in place. A year-to-year would be a start date and an end date. And again, don't get confused that it's a year lease. It could be any number of duration. It just means start date and end date. Where periodic means there's a continuation. At will means permissible. Someone is allowing you to stay. And sufferance is the opposite, means that you're not supposed to be there. And that's where we have that adverse possession. Make sure you know your adverse possessions dates or years in the state that you live in. Now, if you own, you have what's called a freehold. And in a freehold estate, we have different types. We have fee simple. And fee simple means unlimited duration. Go back and think about your bundle of rights. And you'll remember that one of your bundles is disposition. Is at the end of your term of ownership, you can do what you want with your property. So go back and review that. But make sure you understand that when we talk about our fee simple, we have a couple different types. Typically, what you see in residential real estate is fee simple absolute. That is the highest form of ownership. And that means that you can exercise your bundle of rights. And again, we typically use that for residential real estate. Now, we also have special use properties, if you remember what those are. Church, school, government buildings, cemeteries, things of that nature. Well, in that case, we have what we call as defeasible. And that's fee simple defeasible. And if it's fee simple defeasible, we could have a determinable. And determinable means that you have to use the property in the same manner in how it was conveyed to you. Or we can have a condition subsequent, which means that you are unable to perform a certain activity within that property's guidelines. So make sure you understand that if you do have a defeasible property, under what condition is it where you have to do the special limitation or the condition subsequent? So go back and review that. And then we know with our life estates that we have different types of life estates. We have our conventional life estate where we have a life tenant, and we have a per ultra V, which is for the life of another. The most important thing to understand with both those is that it's not upon the death of the original owner. With the conventional, it's upon the death of the life tenant that the property either reverts back to its original owner or it goes to a third party called a remainderment. Where with per ultra V, it's not for the person who's the owner of the property now or living in the property for that matter. It's for the life of another, a third party upon their death the property reverts back to the original owner or goes to another third party called the remainder. So while it may sound confusing, draw a picture, draw that out, because when you do, it starts to visually make sense. That's one of my tips, because I'm a very visual person. So again, these are your estates. Let's go back and review them. Now, let's talk about finance. Okay, we'll talk about finance. And here we have alienation, acceleration, and defeasance. And the things that we want to understand, which is really important when it comes to finance, is that when we talk about an alienation clause, we call this a due on sale clause. And what this means is if you're to transfer property, what that is telling us is that your mortgage, in essence, would have to be paid in full before you could transfer, really to prevent assumable mortgages. If it's acceleration, that means if an individual homeowner defaults on a loan payment, on a mortgage payment, the mortgagee could then accelerate the loan to have that paid in full. So that's what we call an acceleration clause. And defeasance is once you pay back the promissory note that you made between mortgagor and mortgagee. Remember, the mortgagee is, in essence, the bank. The mortgagor is the borrower. That's how I like to remember. They gave a promissory note. And once that's repaid, we have a defeasance clause. So let's make sure we understand the principles of finance. Because again, we talked about the fact there's a lot that's on there. Time to think again. What do we have? 3 investors close on a real estate transaction. If 2 of the investors own equal share and the third share is greater, was created. Take a look. Severalty, tenant in common, joint tenancies, or honestly, I need more information. Well, it's tenant in common. And why is it tenancy in common? Because we know that in order to have a joint tenancy, number one, we have a right of survivorship, which means that if anyone were to die, then the remaining owners take equal shares. But what are the 4 unities of joint tenancy? You need to have these: possession, interest, title, and time. You have to possess the property with the other owners. You have to have equal interest. Where tenancy in common, right away it said they didn't have all equal. So that's how you knew immediately. All of the owners have to be on title, and all of this has to happen at the same time. So those are things that are really important. Okay. The big difference again between tenancy in common and joint tenancy is that right of survivorship. Where a tenant's in common, you are in control of your interest and can do what you want with it, whether it's testate with a will or intestate without a will. So let's see, 3 investors now decided to form a corporation to purchase property. In this case, the ownership interest is what? What do we remember about a corporation? A corporation is an entity that we speak to in singular form. Therefore, a corporation is considered a individual entity or an owner. And we know that when you buy property as an individual, you own property in severalty. So make sure that you pay attention to that. Okay, so let's review the forms of ownership. Severalty, one owner. Co-ownership, tenancy in common, which we reviewed. Joint tenancy, which means you have to have PITT and the right of survivorship. Tenancy by the entirety means married, and community property. And again, pay attention to your state and ask yourself, is this a community property state or is this a marital property state? Because that's going to have different regulations, specifically around death and co-ownership. So make sure you pay attention to those. We often get individuals who get confused about this whole thing called non-conforming use. Well, non-conforming use is referring to zoning. And zoning ultimately tells us how we can use land. And what are the rules and regulations? We have private restrictions and we have public restrictions. And so we want to make sure we understand how we can operate. Let's talk a little bit about a variance and special use. So what you have in the middle here is spot zoning. Tells us how we can use and operate the property that we're occupying. And we have different types of delineation for zoning. If we are operating our property different than what the zoning specifies, that is called non-conforming use. And so if we are in a neighborhood and we had a property, and let's just say the zoning changed, and we want to continue to operate what we're using in that same manner that we have, that would be considered a special use permit. So for example, if I had a convenience store and we were in a neighborhood and all of a sudden it was regulated to a residential zoning area, we're building single family homes. If I want to continue to operate that convenience store to service the individuals that are residential, I need a special use permit. And now that we've been zoned as residential, if I now buy a building and I want to then create a dry cleaner, that's commercial. Because it's residential and I want to now change or modify the current use, I would have to file for a variance. So a variance is ultimately a change too. So those are two different. Make sure you understand those two. Okay. All right. So again, we want to talk a little bit about transfer of title. The biggest confusion that comes around is the difference between title and a deed. We get confused as we think about our car. And when we have our car title, we take that little piece of paper and we transfer it. When we deal with homes, residential property, that document that people are referring to is called a deed, where all of our information on that deed is pertinent and relevant to our property. In that deed is transfer of title, and title proves ownership. So let's not get those two confused. So when we have a deed, we have different types. This is really our warranties. We have a general warranty deed, which conveys 5 warranties, special, which conveys 2, bargain and sale, which really doesn't convey any, it's an assumption, and a quit claim, which really is not conveying any type of warranty at all, but it's more to keep, clear any defects or clouds on title or minor modifications. So if you ever are asked, how do you prove that you own your property? The answer to that question is this: proof of title. And there's 3 ways that you can prove ownership: title insurance, abstract and attorney opinion, and a certificate of title. That's the answer. So deed does not prove ownership. Deed conveys the transfer of title, which conveys ownership. So hopefully we cleared up some of that confusion for all of you. Again, let's test that. A deed is proof of ownership, true or false? What do we know? If we said false, you are absolutely correct. Congratulations. Now, everybody's favorite. Everybody's favorite is I love math. Here's what I'm going to share to all of us. A couple tips when it really comes to the math component, okay, is if you're not a big fan of math, focus on the questions that are not math related and leave the math to the end. And once you get through everything, then you can do a quick shift from right brain to left brain, and you can focus on the math questions. All right. Let's not panic when it comes to math. Let's take our time and let's really understand what's being asked. Many times when we read a math question, we take all these numbers that are floating around and we just plug them into our calculator. That's where we run into problems. Take your time, truly go and review the different formulas. Make sure you understand how to calculate commission from gross to net and net to gross. Make sure you understand your areas, your perimeters, your surface, your frontage, and your volume. Make sure you understand that. Make sure you know about your taxes, your ad valorem. Make sure you know about your transfer tax, okay? Make sure you know your income approach, your IRV, okay? Make sure you know about appreciation and depreciation. Again, if you tie the math into the real estate situation, it might make more sense to you. Don't just look at it from a math concept. Practice, practice, and then practice some more. All right, what can I expect on the state exam, folks? Well, you have a couple experimental questions. So you might get to the point where you get a couple questions that you have no idea and you have never seen it before. Don't panic. There are experimental questions there for a reason. You're not graded on them. You're not getting timed on them. So if you're sitting there trying to figure it out, there's about 5 to 10. And again, the purpose of this is just to test some test questions for potential future tests. Don't worry about those. Okay, don't worry about those. But what can you expect? Again, is I would check that candidate guide. Make sure you understand the number of questions, your passing score. Get familiar with that. Remember, you can always go back and change your answer. All right. Pay attention to your timer and know how much time you have left. If you're not a big fan of the timer because it gives you more anxiety, you can hide that. So it's not just in your face. But I'm going to make one bold recommendation. As you go through the test, what you do is pay attention, because there'll be questions later on that relate back to a question from before that might give you a good indicator of what the right answer may be. However, if you are not 100% positive that the answer you're changing is to the right answer, go with your gut. Because what typically happens is you will go with your gut and you will understand the question and you'll come up with the answer. But when you go back and review, it starts to play some tricks on you, because you'll see one of the answers that sounds like it's a right answer and you change it. And in my experience, individuals who may not do so well, and meaning not pass, they don't not pass by a large amount of questions. It could be that they got one or two away from passing. And usually it's because they went back and changed one or two questions. So do not change your answer unless you are 100% positive. Just a little tip that I want to share with all of you. Now, this is the time where you probably still have a ton of questions. Well, guess what? We want to answer those questions for you. So make sure you take all the questions that you've written down, put those questions in the chat, because we're going to make sure that we answer all those questions for you. Now, if you have questions outside of what you're seeing today, remember, you have support. We have customer service, we've got a phone number, we've got an email, and we've got a website. All the resources that you need are available to you to help you, guide you through this journey. So those top 10 confusing topics are not so confusing. So I want to thank you for dedicating time to being here. I want to wish you the best of luck in your endeavors moving forward. And I just want to say congratulations on embarking on this new journey of obtaining your real estate license. Thank you again for being here.
We want to thank you, Sandesh, for being here. Your knowledge, expertise, and willingness to share it with our student community is greatly appreciated. Again, if you do have questions about anything you've heard today, please do send them to instructor@theceshop.com, and we would be happy to help you there. Please also look for an email from us with a link to today's recorded session, and keep an eye out for additional invites to webinars in the future. We will be doing more of these, and we would like to have you attend those as well. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.